Okay. All right, great. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining. It's great to see that many faces, despite a lot of Zoom meetings and probably a lot of Zoom fatigue already. This is the third session of our workshop series that we organized as part of the Air Media Democracy Lab and the ICDS team here in Amsterdam, which is an interdisciplinary team between communication scientists and information lawyers. My name is Lisa and I'll be moderating the session today. And our main goal today is to discuss potential policy responses to deal with opinion power and structural dependency of news media on digital platforms. Before we start, I'd like to give a brief introduction so we all have a common starting ground. When we talk about opinion power, what we refer to and what we mean is the ability of the media to influence processes of individual and public opinion formation. So over the last years, that power over opinion formation has increasingly shifted away from the legacy media to digital platforms. In that sense, news media organizations not only increasingly lose control over the news content, at least to a certain extent, but they also increasingly become dependent on digital platforms and their infrastructure to distribute content and to reach audiences. This, of course, brings some advantages for media organizations in reaching the audiences better and also to reach new audiences, and also for the consumer, for the audiences, they get access to a wider range of news sources. Still, there's growing consensus that this shift of opinion power and the dependency of news media on digital platforms can bear substantial risks, especially for media pluralism and media sustainability. So in today's discussion, I'm especially curious to hear from the panelists what they think, how we should deal with this shift in opinion power and with the structural dependencies in the media, and what policy responses could be suitable. Also, I'm especially curious to hear what they think of the potential of media concentration law as a complementary approach to dealing with platforms, and also whether they think there are non-regulatory responses that should be considered, and if so, which ones. This is enough from my side. I'd like to welcome the panelists again, and thank you so much for being here today. First of all, we have Ms. Anna Herold. She's head of Audiovisual and Media Services Policy Unit at the European Commission's DG Connect. Then we have, sorry, there's still people adding. Then we have Maria Donde. She's head of International Content Policy at Ofcom in the United Kingdom. And Mr. Victor Picard, professor at the Unberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania in the US. Thank you again. And before I give the floor, just two last remarks. This is a moderated panel discussion, but I still highly encourage the panelists to engage with one another and to directly respond to each other. So there's no need for me to redirect the word. And for the Q&A, Natalie Hellberger will keep an eye on the chat. So if you have questions, comments, remarks, or any other observations, feel free to add them in the chat and we'll pick them up. Also, if you have specific questions, try to indicate who the question is directed to, or you can always raise your hand and speak directly. So, as a kickoff of this discussion, I would like to firstly focus on the potential points of departure of policy interventions to address opinion power and structural dependencies. So perhaps, Victor, I could ask you first. You wrote in a recent article, I quote, "Now is a window of opportunity, most likely a fleeting one, for bold plans and structural reform." Would you like to elaborate a little bit more on how such structural reform could look like, in your opinion, and what should be the specific points of departure for policy intervention?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Thank you also for organizing this conversation we're having today. It's such an important one, and I'm very eager to jump into it. I feel like you've put me on the spot a little bit, but I will just sort of run with it based on that quote. And as an academic, I have the advantage, I guess, to be a little bit more utopian in big picture thinking in terms of what ideally we would do if we were to try to address some of these structural problems that we're dealing with in countries around the world today. And I think, understandably, much of the emphasis is on the platform monopolies, we may refer to them as. And I think it's safe to say that Facebook has far too much power. No profit-driven corporate firm should have such control over a core infrastructure that nearly 3 billion people use on the planet. So we really need to democratize it. And I think we need to throw everything at it, ranging from regulations to possibly breaking up or at least breaking off pieces of it, but also creating public alternatives. And that's what I'm really focusing on a lot in my work. It gets fairly utopian very quickly, but I think we also need to keep that on the table as well, that sometimes it's not just about creating a more fair market, but it's also about trying to remove certain services out of the market altogether. And I'll end on that more ambitious note.
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting. And I think Maria was already smiling a little bit on the public alternatives part. Maybe I can just ask you more generally, Maria. So Ofcom is, of course, focusing a lot of its work on this topic, and maybe you want to elaborate a little more what the UK's approach is more generally to addressing the role of platforms, and then specifically, do you see a role for media concentration law in this context?
Thank you. And I was smiling because I remember actually a couple of years ago hearing Victor speak at the LSE and talking quite a bit about this question of public interest and how what public interest internet might look like, but also just elaborating on some of the principles behind it. And it struck me just how much that sounded a bit like the public service broadcasting framework in Europe. And that stayed with me for a really long time. So it's a delight for me to finally meet you and to be able to discuss this with you, because it really struck me just how much we perhaps sometimes take for granted the what we have in Europe, and how much in fact we are and should be relying on the public service broadcasting framework for addressing some of the underlying problems that we're talking about, for as a ballast against and as a mitigation against. That was not your question, I realized, Teresa, but I just thought of I would shout out for the PSBs, which is intrinsically important in the discussion about plurality anyway, independent of course and well-funded PSBs. But in terms of how Ofcom is looking at the question of platforms and where that sits within our discussions of plurality and concentration law is very timely, as you say. We published a statement last November on the back of a call for evidence that we put out earlier in the year, in the summer, where we wanted to, so Ofcom has an obligation to conduct a regular review of the media ownership rules in the UK, which is essentially the concentration rules that we have. So we did that, but we also wanted to look more broadly beyond just the ownership rules and see what was going on in the media markets and what we should be aware of in terms of potential risks. And the questions we asked about were indeed about the roles of intermediaries, the impact of algorithmic content curation, and anything else that anyone wanted to tell us about. And as a result of that call for evidence, we made some conclusions, which were, I'm afraid to say, that more evidence is needed, and that we need to understand some of these risks a bit better. But we certainly identified, for example, the fact that there was clearly a potential problem with the role that intermediaries and the way that they use algorithms to promote prioritized content for the range of viewpoints that citizens could access, that were available to them and that they were consuming. So these are two aspects of the how we see plurality. It's about availability, but it's also about consumption, and it's about impact. So we identified that clear problem, which we want to look into in more detail. So we are currently in the process of trying to understand and to map some of those structural dependencies that you're talking about. I would think that we would take a fairly close look at the work done by the ACCC in Australia, for example, who tried quite hard, I think, to try to understand the value movement between platforms and publishers, which is highly relevant to this question. But also, I think we are going to have to note that there is a transparency problem. That there is a lack of information that means not only can people not really properly understand how they're accessing the information that's being provided to them and how that's being controlled, but also regulators can't either. And I think there, and it is a link that some of the respondents to our call for evidence made, there is a link to the online harms regulation that's taking place in across Europe. Actually, the DSA has provisions on this. I'm sure Anna will be able to talk much better about this, but the online safety bill in the UK also, which is a really sort of forensic focus on transparency from the platforms and the need for greater information for both the public and regulators to be able to understand some of these effects. And only then, I think, can we move to the stage of looking at interventions and what those interventions might be.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting. And you mentioned also just now the DSA, which I think Anna can add some to. So of course, there's a lot of, the Commission has dedicated a lot of its work to addressing the role of platforms to improve transparency, especially with the DSA package, the Digital Services Act package. But now also more recently, the Media Freedom Act has entered the discourse. So I'm wondering, Anna, if you would like to elaborate a bit more on how the Media Freedom Act could be complementing these regulatory efforts, and how exactly can it help deal with the challenges to media pluralism?
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you for having me in this interesting debate, especially because now we are indeed closed, in our virtual offices and very busy, in trying to work out, what indeed could be the scope of this new initiative. I think, maybe just to start from a broader premise, in a way you can see in all the Commission's effort, and regulating what is, I think the focus of this debate, as you said it in your introduction, the opinion-making power of those that make media content available to us, and these structural dependencies created by the platforms that have become, an integral part of the way we access media content, has always been at the EU level to look at news media content very much as, of course, an economic sector in itself, but of course also a public good. And that has been a bit of the leitmotif of some of the reforms that we have undertaken already in the last mandate with the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. Maria has talked already on the also on this kind of duality of these reforms on online harms and the discussion that we are having today, and in particular the copyright package. So what we have tried to put in place with the new rules on the publisher's right, but also on the so-called value gap. So that has been already started, and in a way the DSA and the DMA have to be seen as a continuation of that policy. And I think everybody probably in the circle will be quite well aware of what is in the DSA, which is quite, and also in the DMA, both are quite overarching frameworks, trying to look at all possible issues that may arise in this context of the structural dependencies, as you call them, for today's debate. And that, ranges from transparency that has been already mentioned to certain, access to data issues that are, of course, crucial in this relationship in the DMA, to issues such as algorithmic transparency and, most importantly, risks assessment and potential mitigating measures that certain of these platforms, because of their role as public spaces, public places, will have to put in place in the future. So this is a bit, I would say the DSA and DMA in a pill. But what we have noticed that if we really look at news media content as public good, that probably what has been a bit of a missing element in all these reforms is precisely to zoom a bit of a closer look at how we can ensure the integrity of the informational content that is that we access, and also exposure to a diversity of that content, which I think is probably the main issue in the online environment. So this is a bit the two leitmotifs of these reforms that we are now considering under the Media Freedom Act. On the one hand, how can we make sure that there are enough safeguards for editorial independence, high deontological standards across the EU that would of course benefit all the media players and put them on an equal footing, and at the same time how we can seek more media diversity in all sectors. And that of course also means having a closer look at media concentration laws, without let's say the Commission wanting to revolutionize what member states have in place, but we have I think good starting points with some recent jurisprudence also at least put in place incentives for member states to rethink how they look at media concentration in this new digital environment.
Yeah, thank you. So what I'm thinking when whenever I think about media concentration law, the first question that pops up is, how do you measure media concentration law these days? And that's very much the problem. I think that the current frameworks that are in place, they fail to capture the trends of media concentration, and they fail to effectively or proactively target trends of dominant opinion power. So the question is really, and maybe Maria, you can say something to that, and also Victor. Maria, there have been a lot of reform suggestions in the past already, not only from Ofcom, but also in Germany, CAC has tried to address these issues. So I'm wondering, why do you think these efforts so far has not been successful? Where do you see like the biggest challenges in this context?
I mean, I can have a go at this. I think looking certainly at the UK situation, the UK example, there is a sort of a fairly historical and well-defined framework for dealing with problems of media concentration, and it's quite difficult, I think, to make significant, meaningful changes to it without redefining the markets that we're talking about. I mean, I will say that we did make one proposal actually in our statement in November, which was to introduce a new category to the current media concentration laws. I mean, these are just proposals from the regulator to the government. It's obviously will be up to the legislature to decide whether or not they want to take up these recommendations. But we proposed introducing a new category of so-called news creators to remove the current references to media enterprises and newspapers. But this is a mere, I would say, probably an updating of almost of the reality, really, which is that there are new types of publishers. There are simply new types of publishers, but they're still publishers, and we still kind of recognize them and understand them as publishers. But you're absolutely right, because the whole premise of the concentration law is to avoid concentration of opinion power. And I just think that we're still quite a long way from making very clear statements about the shift in opinion power. I think, you know, I absolutely hear the things that this community is saying, certainly, and, you know, the discussions that I've heard from your colleagues, but I do think governments are quite a long way still from drawing that same conclusion. The other thing I would also I think point to is the fact that in our conclusions on all of this, we did in fact say that this is just the UK situation, and you know, each country's concentration laws are different. You probably know more about this than I do, but they are kind of quite complex and very historically sort of, you know, built up and so on. I'm sure maybe Natalie has more to say about this, but we noted that actually in a situation where a large intermediary platform, which played a role in the distribution and access to news, were to be involved in some sort of media acquisition or something like that, that in fact would trigger a concern under our current laws, because they would be a relevant actor. Now, again, slightly obtuse UK situation, it would be for the Secretary of State, for the Minister to refer it to Ofcom to run a public interest test about that. But it's not that it would be excluded from the legislation, such a purchase. However, we're still talking about purchases here. We're only talking about mergers, acquisitions, and so on. But we're not talking about what the current situation is, and we're not talking about, for example, someone very, very, you know, pointed out in our consultation that what happens to all of the media enterprises which are just dying away? You know, how do we reflect that? We have no way of there is no public interest test to be run in the event of publishers, local media closing. So that's the problem. Yeah, I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
Yeah, for sure. And I think especially in recent months and in recent months especially, I think we could see that there is a lot of initiatives and trends towards focusing on media sustainability and empowering news producers' position in bargaining situations against platforms. So we've had the News Media Bargaining Code in Australia last year. And also in the US Congress proposed the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, which also aims at strengthening news publishers' collective negotiation powers. So perhaps, Victor, you want to jump in there and focus a little bit on that?
Yes, gladly. So many great points that I wish I could take the time to respond to, but I'm glad that Maria brought this up, because as much as media ownership concentration restrictions are still very important, and we forget that sometimes when we're focusing so much on Facebook, I would say an even greater problem is the loss of journalism altogether, that the market's no longer supporting the levels of news content that we need. And I'm so thankful that Anna framed it as a public good, because I think that's exactly how we should see news and information that's no longer being supported by the market. And one of the first impulses has been to blame the platforms, and they are certainly culpable. They're exacerbating the problem. They are gobbling up all the digital advertising revenue, but they're not the core root of the problem. Unfortunately, the bills, the one that you just mentioned, the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, is one of the main bills that are being considered right now. And you're right, it's inspired by the Australian model, and it's basically suspending these antitrust rules so that publishers can essentially collude and present a united front to the platforms to negotiate a better, better terms to get more advertising revenue. But even if all that advertising revenue returned to the publishers, it would not save journalism. It would disproportionately help the very publishers who themselves are complicit in exacerbating the journalism crisis. Rupert Murdoch is often the poster child for this accusation. So I think it's unfortunate that so much emphasis is being placed on it, even though I understand why that is. And that also will get us into this anti-monopoly thrust that I'm sure we'll discuss momentarily.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the News Media Bargaining Code in Australia last year showed also quite clearly that it's not that straightforward, but that it can even benefit larger outlets more than smaller outlets at the end of the day. I think Victor, oh yeah, Maria, please jump in. Just talk.
Sorry, the etiquette. But I just, the one thing that it might be worth mentioning here is that one of the reasons why perhaps there is a reluctance to address this through media concentration law is precisely because of that focus on competition, that there's this big drive of proposals to precisely to focus on the overall power of the platforms, irrespective of whether it's to do with media or not, and that might solve all kinds of other different problems, and we can just do it all in this one fell swoop, and it's a little bit like a football being passed around. And also, and the one thing that occurs to me, and I'd be really interested to hear from this, because it could just be my ignorance, but I'm not sure I've heard any really substantial proposals for how to amend concentration law to address some, if not all, of the problems that might exist. And again, that might be because there is a failure to really kind of qualify and categorize and accurately describe those problems as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there have been some proposals, but it's not as straightforward and as clear. So, for instance, there have been suggestions to define platforms as media companies in the context of media concentration law, which of course is not the solution either. So I think in this debate, what we often encounter is that either something is not a real structural solution, or doesn't provide any proper systemic fixes to the situation, or it's simply not working as straightforward. So I'm just wondering, as a last question also, if you think there are other non-regulatory responses that we could be focusing on or should be discussing as well. I'll give all of you the floor, whoever wants to answer.
I can maybe chip in. First, maybe to say that yes, it's true, absolutely, what Maria is saying, that the complexity and also the simple the historic and cultural background of this media concentration approaches makes it a very, very challenging area, and probably there is not much movement in many of the at least EU member states to do much about them. Having said that, we have seen recently a bit of a wind of change, so the recent discussion in France that I'm sure you are aware of showed that even I think it was the media regulator actually that clearly said that these rules do not seem, how should I put it, anymore adapted to the new realities, and we should look at them. And now there is this mission both by the ministries to review the rules, and also this commission of inquiry in the French Senate to look at these rules. So I think it's extremely interesting to see it. Of course, we have to see it in France also in the particular context of the upcoming presidential elections. So there is part of, how should I put it, also of politics in it. But we observe these developments with a lot of interest, and I think also in the Netherlands. Now I'm taking the opportunity also to ask a question. Maybe we have heard at least that that there has been substantive deregulation in that sector, with the economic argument, if I understood it well, being put forward. That precisely the need to boost the viability of the sector in view of this shift to internet news media consumption that was used as a justification. So just to put it on the table, that it is a very closed and hermetic, how should I put it, area of law, but there is a wind of change. And then coming to your question, sorry, I'm a bit long, but there I will be short. I think on the non-regulatory responses, I think that essentially, at least from the Commission's perspective, we have two. One is, unsurprisingly, for an institution like a Commission, the idea to at least mobilize public support. And while personally I might not have been, at least in the, let's say, philosophically a big fan of the government, funding media, of course, we see merit now in view of what is happening, especially, you know, with the economic crisis, to think about smart ways of trying, you know, to boost innovation, collaboration, especially, you know, at an EU level. So this is a bit, you know, the premise of these new initiatives that we've announced in the Media Action Plan, you know, to think about basically something like a journalism fund at EU level. And the second response, and this we have already tried to put on the table in the consultation on the Media Freedom Act, of course, is the media self-regulation. We have been trying to support the media councils that exist not in all member states, but in many. And we see that, of course, these self-regulatory bodies that are crucial for upholding deontological standards are struggling, you know, with no surprise. I mean, the media are struggling, no, and those bodies that, in a way, you know, are kind of an additional. No, if a journalist, you know, cannot make a living, it's a bit difficult, you know, to care about, you know, ethics and solving cases, you know, among peers. So this is another, I think, important area of reflection. What can we do, you know, to really support this? Because I think this should be cherished, you know, this tradition that we have. Of high deontological standards. It can be a true antidote, you know, for all these illnesses that we are discussing, you know, already for years, you know, disinformation, biased reporting, manipulative reporting. And in Europe, unfortunately, we have seen more and more of that, unsurprisingly, and in particular, maybe in some member states more than in others because of particular political climates. But it is a fundamental issue, I think, to have a closer look at.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Victor, do you want to jump in?
Yes, just quickly, I will add under this idea of non-regulatory responses, there's so much emphasis on stopping the bad stuff out there, stopping the hate speech, stopping the online harms. But I think we also have to emphasize as much, if not more, ways to generate good, reliable news content. And again, I think since we are talking about systemic market failure here, we have to imagine new non-market means of support for the journalism that democracy requires. And I do think there are creative ways of doing this. I think there are ways of doing it where governments do not own and control the media. That's always a great fear here in the United States. And I think there's been progress in these understandings. Also, just looking at the relationship between democracy and strong public service broadcasting systems, we're seeing increasing evidence that they positively correlate. So I think that has to be something we look at closely as well. But the last thing I'll say, and this is more of a regulatory intervention, we also could apply public interest protections onto the platforms, make sure that they signal boost reliable news content, such as content coming from public service broadcasters, for example. So that's just one more regulatory intervention to consider, but I do think we need to emphasize this non-market kind of public alternatives that I keep coming back to.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess to add to the media funding part that Anna mentioned, I think it's especially important to make sure those are long-term structural changes and not just short-term investments. So I think a lot of the funding that's coming from private companies like Google and Facebook, they're essentially short-term investments into news organizations, but no long-term solutions. Yeah, I'm just seeing the time. It's already quite late. So I think we can open the floor for the discussion, for the Q&A. If anyone has any questions, comments, feel free to raise your hand or to put your question in the chat. We have good 20 minutes still left to discuss anything. I see Thomas has asked a question, or Natalie. Thomas is not here right now. So Natalie, perhaps you want to...
Oh yeah, Thomas was first, but I'm very happy to... oh, I think there he is.
I was just wondering, thank you very much for this super interesting panel. I was just wondering what role do you think journalists and other media workers should play in the development of these in these policies? I feel like sometimes we talk about platforms and we talk about the owners of media organizations, but how do we integrate, if at all, if it's necessary, how do we integrate media workers into this discussion, into this conversation?
Who would you like to answer?
I can have a quick go at that because I have some thoughts on this. So firstly, I think actually they are quite well